Hey, welcome back to our Dear Church interview series. Today I'm here with Paul Molyneux, who spoke an awesome message this weekend on grace. If you haven't checked out that message, it'll be in the description. I recommend that you go watch that message, check it out before coming back here so you can understand a bit of what we're going to be going over. But Paul, thanks for joining me.
Hi Matt, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, an awesome message on the weekend was really great, and a fresh perspective on grace there, and how to live counterculturally as Christians. And I kind of want to open by asking you, what is so countercultural about grace?
Well, I think it was coming through in the book of Titus in that particular context. It was such a corrupt context, and we referenced a couple of passages, particularly verse 12 of Titus chapter 1, that said that, all of these people from Crete were liars and, immoral. And so for the gospel to come to this place, Paul was talking to Titus about how is it possible for the gospel to change the culture. And that's what the gospel does in any culture that it goes to, whether it was back then or today. And really the message that Paul had for Titus was, it's the way you live your life, that life of grace, extending grace to others, extending grace to yourself, is going to be the opportunity for a different perspective on what culture is. And so it becomes countercultural when we don't just fit in with the culture that are around us. And this is what the message of grace does for us.
And you talked about having grace for ourselves, which is a really interesting point that you brought up in the message, where you talked about the story of the woman caught in adultery, and how sometimes in our own life we can pick up stones for ourselves to turn back on ourselves. Can you expand on that a little bit and elaborate on that concept there?
Yeah, look, I think there's two aspects to extending grace to ourselves. Most of us probably spend most of our lives trying to achieve. And I think when we have a look at, even as a child-parent relationship as children, we're always trying to seek the affirmation of our parents. And I think we can do it if we're not careful with God. That if we could just work hard enough, or witness enough, share enough, do enough, that I'll earn God's favour. But the message of grace is I already have God's favour, that He's already for me. He's forgiven me. And in the story that we see of the woman caught in adultery, she was extended grace. And I think the example that I felt, a picture that I got going into the weekend is, and I used the example of those stones that, people had picked up ready to throw at her. And Jesus says, I don't condemn you. And the narrative I had is that actually, if we're not careful, we can condemn ourselves. Even though Jesus has forgiven us, we've got to extend that grace and understand. And there were some examples over the weekend of people that we prayed for at the end of our service had been carrying sin and carrying mistakes that they had made. But this is the message of grace, to be kind to ourselves, and that if God has forgiven us, then that gives us the power to be able to forgive ourselves as well. And I think that was a significant part over the weekend. And, I sensed many people experience freedom. And it's not until we talk about some of these issues and some of these topics that give us permission to go and do that business with God that we need to do, to seek forgiveness that He's already given us. But then we can extend that to ourselves.
Yeah, it can be hard for us sometimes to not just forgive others, but forgive ourselves, especially if we're holding on to things that we feel guilty for. And it's God's graciousness that really breaks through. And in that message, it's amazing to hear that people felt that they had that freedom there. And even for me, when I heard that, I was like, looking back into my own life, and wow, that's a great point.
It would be naive of us to think that none of us have made mistakes. And so this is the message. This happens for all of us, that whether they're different levels of decisions, different levels of aspects, that we've made mistakes throughout our lives. Poor decisions, poor choices, they're a once-off. They don't set the tone of our life. And this is what the message of grace does for us, and gives us permission to move on.
Yeah. And is grace something that only Christians are able to access? Is grace open for non-Christians, or do you only receive God's grace once you become a Christian?
Well, the two aspects of grace that I spoke about on the weekend, first of all, was saving grace. And so saving grace is literally somebody who is not a follower of Jesus coming to faith to experience grace. And so grace is available to all of us. And in fact, that's what Paul, over 100 times throughout the New Testament that he writes, this is a topic. And Paul's called the Apostle of Grace. And he was somebody who was persecuting Christians before he encountered that grace. So if anybody can talk about grace, I think Paul can. Yeah. And so, and while there'll be a lot of people that feel that they're far from God, Paul's an example of, somebody who is transformed by the message of grace and the power of grace. So for all of us, Christian, non-Christian, all of us can receive that saving grace. The second aspect that we spoke about was that empowering grace that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians, because we all face situations. And again, going back to that Titus message, in the book of Titus, Paul was talking to him about living with grace in the community that they're a part of. They said that all Cretans are liars. So everybody that lived on Greece was a liar. Yeah. And so for you to be able to act counterculturally, you'd have to have a extra dose of grace to be filled with grace, because if you want to let your life be the message and everybody you talk to is lying to you, well, you need God's grace to persevere, to empower you, to fill you, to be able to be living out that approach of grace into some of the day-to-day life experiences. That's the model that we had then, and I think it's still for us now. Because life doesn't always go, every day doesn't go the way we plan. Yeah. There'll be the little things of grace that we need to extend, and then there's going to be some big things that they're pretty significant life experiences that we need to allow God's grace to help us, to give us energy, to give us the ability to forgive, and to really live out the way and the mission that God has for us.
Yeah. And for some, I guess it would be tough to understand the concept of grace, and that we're not saved by all the good things that we do. How can we kind of explain that free gift of saving grace and salvation that God offers?
And I think this is what makes Paul so powerful, because it's a constant topic through the New Testament. 100 times Paul talks about the message of grace, and there is no other religion that talks about grace as a free gift of how you engage with God. Other religions talk about what you have to do to be saved. Christianity is very different. We have God's love. It's a free gift for us. But once you experience grace, it affects every aspect of your life and calls us to live a life that is serving God. So there's a balance we've got to have there, because there's nothing we can do to earn it. But once you experience it, it'll transform the way that you want to live, because we want to live to please our Heavenly Father.
That's awesome. And God is, as we've talked about, all loving, all gracious. He extends His grace to us in so many ways, even when we don't deserve it. Does that mean, though, that we can continue to live a life of sin and evil and just expect God's grace to continually just be upon us? No matter how many times we mess up, God's grace is always going to be there.
And that's the beauty of grace, that God's grace is always there for us. But Bonhoeffer, in his book, The Call to Discipleship, talks about cheap grace and costly grace. And cheap grace being exactly what you've just spoken about, that there's this constant coming back to God with no transformation in the way we live. Whereas Bonhoeffer says actually costly grace is the grace that God extends to us, and we respond to Him in such a way that it does cost everything. Costs the way we live, and we choose to live a life that is pleasing to God rather than this cheap way of taking advantage of God's grace that is there for us. I think it's a great thought by Bonhoeffer that challenges us because we're not always going to get it right. And we're not always going to err on the side of costly grace. We've probably all delved in a bit of cheap grace through our lives. And so it's important for us to find that balance because the analogy is costly grace costs us everything. Costs us to lay our own life down, and it'll cause us, because we've experienced grace in such a way, it'll cause us to live in a particular fashion, cause us to move in a particular direction where we lay our life down for others, and it'll impact all that we do. And we see it right through our church community. We see it right through the world that people have experienced God's grace and now living counterculturally, living in a whole different way that to some people doesn't make a lot of sense. About serving the poor, serving others rather than trying to solve all of our own needs. There's something about pouring out your own life, giving your life away for the benefit of others. And that's when we really experience God's grace actively within our lives.
Yeah. And you talked about the costliness of giving up even our own life in terms of grace. And it's an interesting dynamic in trying to show grace even when it will leave us worse off. Like you talked about Lisa's tennis team in the competition, they showed grace to the other team, and in the end they didn't make the grand final because of that. How can we forgive those or show grace to those that have hurt us badly, or show grace to people that their mistakes is going to cost us a lot by us showing grace?
And this is where the gospel hits our lives, because when there's an impact for us, this is the model that Jesus gave us, that we would literally give our lives, whether it's over a tennis match, which is, in the scheme of things, probably fairly low level, but there are some significant life situations that people work through. And as we experience God's grace, there's times when I've felt I'm literally hanging on to God's grace because I need it in some of these situations where I'm called to love my enemies, when I'm called to bless those who persecute me. It may not happen regularly, but on those occasions, how do I react and how do I respond? And that's the message of grace, because we know that in Lisa's situation, it opened the door for a conversation about Alpha. And generally, grace responses will open somebody's heart, open a door. We experience it even in our own neighbourhood. When I know that when I do a random act of kindness for somebody, that opens the door to a conversation. When I pull my neighbour's bins in, on their behalf. In fact, another funny story is our neighbours were away recently, and I noticed one Sunday afternoon their front door was open and I could hear their alarm going off. And I was heading out somewhere, and I went over to their house, called out. There was nobody there. Somehow the door had been pushed over. And so I closed the door, locked up their house for them, sent them a text message, and a few weeks later, they came back from holidays and brought me over a gift, and we had a long conversation. In fact, they knew who it was because they've got a security camera, and they could see that their door was open. They could see that I'd gone over there to help solve an issue for them that they couldn't. It's a very small example, but what I found is that it opened the door to a conversation. And again, we're able to engage with our neighbours and have a really positive conversation together.
Yeah, that's awesome. And can you think of any other moments in your life where you really had to step out and show grace in a situation where it would not have benefited you, or even a situation where you look back like, I really should have shown grace to this person or this situation?
Yeah, look, I think we all have particular situations that as we work through different seasons of our lives, that we can experience different aspects of grace? Look, I think from my perspective, it would be in a lot of work situations when there's been a disagreement, we have different views on particular issues and how things should get done. I've always found that if I try to extend grace, if I try to understand a little bit of what sits behind somebody else's response, is it about this particular issue? Is it about me? Is there something about me that has caused this difficult situation? And so I find when I can extend grace, and we've got to be perceptive, we've got to be open to the Holy Spirit speaking to us, but when I hear that small voice in just pausing and asking a question, that's when I get the opportunity to extend grace.
And I guess that's not necessarily the norm in our society, where you will actually look at the person sitting across from you and try to put yourself in their position and try and understand what they're going through and show that grace. And how can we, have countercultural values, or what are some of the countercultural values that the church should display or should have when it comes to our culture in Australia, especially around, like you said, work, even within relationships with intimate partners or friendships? Like, what are some of the core values that we should display there to live in a countercultural way?
Well, I think rather than trying to get from everybody, that our approach is to give. And whether that's in a workplace relationship or even within our own families, if we live in such a way where the culture tells us to get everything for ourselves and that we should get the first helping, we should get the first serve, everything should be about us, they're the seeds of any relationship falling apart. I found in the workplace, whenever I talk to somebody and ask a second question to see how they are, inquire about their family, you tend to have a pretty positive response. When you show interest in other people and show that you genuinely care for them, I think these are the ways that we live counterculturally. Trying to understand other people's perspectives and not be driven by fear, because there's a lot of fear in things that, well, if I help somebody out at work, I won't get the promotion, or something's going to go bad for me. When in fact, as we serve each other, these become culture-setting acts in our workplace. And for all of us, it allows us to express our faith, have an influence on the community that is around us, have an influence on the people that are around us, and ultimately, it's not even for an outcome, it's to make the world a better place and show people what it is to have the security and the faith that comes from an encounter with Jesus.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think you've expanded on your message there beautifully.
I think the message of Titus is a really encouraging one for us as we get to the end of this Dear Church series. Paul spent time encouraging Titus. He spoke to the leaders of the church first. In chapter 2, he speaks to all the Christians there, and then he speaks in chapter 3 to everybody and reminds them the power of grace, reminds them of what it is that Jesus has done for all of us. And I think it's an invitation for us as Christians and for those who don't yet know Jesus, for us to encounter God's love and His grace. And through that, we'll have an influence around every situation that we're a part of, whether that's our family, our workplace, our churches, our communities and sporting clubs. And I think this is a great invitation to us, great invitation for everybody to live the way that God's intended us to.
Yeah. Nah, that's awesome. And yeah, like I said, beautifully expanding on your message there and opening up what it is to live counterculturally, not to, live in fear, but to show grace and to be giving and not looking to get. So thank you so much for joining us again this week. If you have any questions, as always, leave them in the comments. We'd love to help answer those. But Paul, thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll see you for the next one.
Thank you.